Welcome to our analysis of the evolution and organization of the federal bureaucracy. Today, the overwhelming majority of the almost 20 million state and local bureaucrats, and possibly as many as 15 million shadow bureaucrats, provide various national public services. Through devolution and contracting out, the national government relies on these non-national bureaucrats to serve the people's daily needs. National bureaucrats monitor these state, local, and shadow bureaucrats' compliance with the rules and regulations that come with devolution and outsourcing. As we talked about earlier this year, devolution is the federal government's shifting of greater responsibility for financing and administering public policies to state and local governments, putting the implementation of national policy in the hands of state and local bureaucrats. Mandates in federal laws require state and local governments to implement national policies. In cases where national law preempts, or takes precedence over, state and local law, state and local bureaucrats have to implement federal policy instead of state or local programs. Preemption is common, for example, in the area of environmental protection, where state and local officials must ensure private and public sector compliance with federal air, water, and landfill standards. As we've seen, the national government also contracts with shadow bureaucracies, private, for-profit, and non-profit organizations to provide vital services as well as to produce certain resources needed to serve the public. Outsourcing, for example, includes the federal government's contracting out with Lockheed Martin and Boeing for the production of defense or resources such as helmets, fighter planes, and laser-guided missiles. Traditionally, too, the government undertakes large capital projects such as the construction of roads and government buildings through contracts with private businesses. Further, the federal government outsources medical as well as social research to cure disease and address the ills of society. And through government contracts, the Red Cross has dispensed disaster relief for decades. The federal government's contracts totaled more than $523 billion in its 2009 budget. The national government expects that contracting out will reduce the expense of government by eliminating the overhead costs, including employee benefits and basic operating costs, of producing public goods and services. Outsourcing also provides a means by which the government can hire experts and specialists when they are needed and keep them off the payroll at other times. The government can eliminate those contracted personnel and their costs more easily than it can fire civil servants who have job protection. The expectation is that the private and non-profit sector employees and organizations will be more efficient and effective than government bureaucracies. Some government contracts and grants in aid flow to faith-based organizations, or FBOs. This development has sparked concerns about the preservation of the constitutionally mandated separation of church and government. Even with the increased use of state, local, and shadow bureaucrats, the national bureaucracy itself is neither small nor streamlined. It is composed of thousands of bodies with a variety of names and organizational structures. The national bureaucracy, an evolving organism, continues to grow in complexity even as it privatizes and devolves more of its work. 4 million people resided in the United States in 1789. The year George Washington was sworn in as the first president. Most of them lived off the land and were self-sufficient. They expected few services from the national government. The federal bureaucracy consisted of the Department of War, Department of Foreign Affairs, Treasury Department, Attorney General's Office, and Postal Service Office. That's one of your multiple choice questions, so please note that. Those 3 departments and 2 offices handled the core functions demanded of the national government at that time, respectively providing defense, managing foreign affairs, collecting revenues, and paying bills, resolving lawsuits and legal questions, and delivering mail. Initially, other than for military personnel, the work of public servants was mostly clerical in nature. Today, as the U.S. population tops 300 million, more than 2,000 executive branch units, employing 4 million bureaucrats, 2.7 million civilian bureaucrats, and about 1.5 million military personnel, implement volumes of national policies. The number of bureaucrats is equal to the nation's population in 1789. If you look at this organizational chart of the federal government, it provides a window on the breadth of the federal bureaucracy today. These two figures show the growth in size and cost of the national bureaucracy since the 1940s. Political scientists distinguish among 5 categories of executive branch organizations based on their structure and the type of work they perform. Departments, independent administrative agencies, independent regulatory commissions, government corporations, and agencies in the executive office of the president. Within each category, there is much variation in size, structure, and function. When Congress and the President authorize a new policy, they must decide whether they will assign its implementation to an existing agency or create a new agency. If they choose the latter option, they must determine which type of agency to create. The Department of Homeland Security, established in 2002, is the newest of 15 federal departments, each responsible for one broadly defined policy area. That's an important distinction. The President holds the 15 departments accountable through the appointment of a head official. Secretary is the title of this top political appointee in all departments except the Department of Justice, where the head is the Attorney General. Although the Senate must confirm them, these top appointees serve as the President's pleasure. Make sure you note that that is a Senate confirmation. In addition to appointing the department secretaries, the President names bureaucrats to positions in several levels of the hierarchy below the secretaries. These political appointees have titles such as Deputy Secretary, Assistant Deputy Secretary, Agency Director, and Deputy Director. Let's look at independent administrative agencies. Whereas each executive branch department has authority for a broadly defined area, a host of independent administrative agencies are each responsible for a more narrowly defined function of the national government. Once again, an important distinction. Congress and the President create these agencies to fulfill one of several purposes. Some of them, such as the Smithsonian Institution, were established to handle new governmental functions that did not easily fall within the purview of existing departments. Other independent administrative agencies support the work of existing departments and agencies, including recruiting and training employees, Office of Personnel Management, and managing government properties and records, General Services Administration. Still others, such as the National Science Foundation and the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, also known as NASA, focus on research and preservation of national resources. Structurally independent administrative agencies look like cabinet departments, with a single head appointed by the President. However, these agencies are independent because Congresses and Presidents place them outside of the cabinet departments. That's an important distinction. In addition, these agencies have a varying level of independence from the President. Some independent administrative agency heads serve fixed terms, making their agencies independent from the President. In other agencies, the heads serve at the pleasure of the President, but the President must have a cause, misconduct or malfeasance, to remove them. In yet other agencies, the President can remove the head without specifying a cause. Although the structures of independent administrative agencies are expected to make them independent of patrician politics, ultimately, such agencies still need to earn the support of those who authorize the spending of money and who have authority to restructure the agency or its mission, Congress or the President. Over time, Congress and presidents have recognized the need for expertise in regulating the country's diverse economic activities and their impact on the overall economy, workers, consumers, and the environment. Acknowledging their own lack of such expertise, they have created numerous independent regulatory commissions, bureaucracies outside of the cabinet departments with the authority to develop standards of behavior for specific industries and businesses, to monitor compliance with these standards, and to impose sanctions on those it finds guilty of violating the standards. This would be a good time to stop, rewind, and play that part again. Initially, such government regulation centered on economic regulation. matters such as setting the prices of goods and services and ensuring competition in the marketplace. The first independent regulatory commission, the Interstate Commerce Commission, or ICC, in 1887, was set up to oversee the prices and services of the railroad industry. Beginning in the 1960s, Congress turned more in the direction of social regulation, establishing regulatory commissions that focused on how business practices affected the environment and the health and safety of consumers and workers. For example, legislation created the Consumer Product Safety Commission in 1972. Independent regulatory agencies are under the direction of bipartisan boards whose members do not need to be loyal to the president's preferences. Please make that distinction in your notes. Typically, the president nominates and the Senate confirms an odd number of board members. Board members serve staggered, fixed terms. This structure allows the agency to make decisions based on the expertise of its board members, not on the preferences of the president or Congress. Still, the agencies need both presidential and congressional support to survive. As you're going through this video, make sure you're noting which ones require Senate confirmation. Like private businesses, government corporations sell a service or a product, but unlike private businesses, they are government-owned. Congress and the President create government corporations when they believe it is in the public interest for the national government to engage in a commercial activity, such as selling stamps to pay for the cost of delivering mail. In fact, the best-known U.S. government corporation is the United States Postal Service. Unlike other categories of bureaucracies, government corporations are expected to make enough money to cover their costs. A bipartisan board typically directs each government corporation. The president appoints the board members to serve for staggered, fixed terms. Typically, the Senate is not required to confirm the board members. Like regulatory commissions and administrative agencies, government corporations are structured to be independent. By 1939, the national bureaucracy, for which the president serves as chief executive officer, had grown tremendously in size and diversity of structures and functions. Acknowledging that the president need help to manage this constellation of departments, independent administrative agencies, independent regulatory commissions, and government corporations, President Franklin Roosevelt and the Congress created the Executive Office of the President. The EOP is composed of dozens of offices and councils that assist the president in managing the complex and sprawling executive branch of the bureaucracy. The EOP has evolved into the locomotive of the national government, the engine driving the development and implementation of presidential policies and programs. The president appoints the top-level bureaucrats in EOP agencies, and the majority of these appointments are not subject to Senate confirmation. The president has the authority to fire these appointees at his pleasure. Therefore, the EOP serves the president. It is, in fact, the presidential bureaucracy. Lastly, we have hybrids. Although political scientists commonly talk about 5 categories of bureaucracies, not all bureaucracies fit neatly into a given category. In addition to the 5 categories of bureaucracy we have considered, the executive branch features hybrid agencies that have characteristics of more than one category. The Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, is one such hybrid. The FDA regulates the food and pharmaceutical industries to ensure the safety of food and drugs on the market, and hence is a regulatory agency. Yet, it is not an independent regulatory commission because it is housed within the Department of Health and Human Services, which is a cabinet position. In this section, we took stock of the executive branch organizations in which national bureaucrats implement policy.